Good evening. Hope all of you are well. Today we're learning Maseches, Kesubos, Daf Yud Aleph, and as well Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, and we're going to go down to the Mishnah at the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Aleph. And tomorrow night we'll pick up with the balance of Daf Yud Beis and Daf Yud Gimel. Also tomorrow night, not in person, on Zoom, live at the right time, and then of course I'll upload. Let's get started. The Mishnah begins on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph and reads Hagioris v'hashvuya v'hashivcha. If you have a woman who's converted, or a woman who was held captive, or a woman who was a shivcha, and then sheniftu v'shenizgairu v'shenishtacharu, each of them respectively go through their freeing up process, and that would be a pidyon for the shivuyim and a gerus for the giores, and nishtachru is a shivcha who got freed. If they are pechusos mibenos shalosh shana v'yom echad, if they are redeemed, if they are freed before their third birthday, then even though we otherwise would have assumed that had they been a shivcha or a shivuya or a gioris, that they've had tashma shamita and they could no longer have a tainas basulim, but that's not the way things are, because since they're under 3, we assume that their basulim will grow back and they therefore should have a regular ksuba, and that's how the Mishnah concludes that ksubas on masayim, they get a regular ksuba of 200. They're regular women. And if a husband then would taina that on the first night when they get married, that he doesn't sense that there's a basulim, he'd be able to aser her to him. So that's what we have learned. And the Gemara is going to go through a couple of questions that uses our Mishnah as a leverage point. So let's get started 5 lines down in the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna, ger katan matbilan osa das bezdin. A ger katan, we are matbilan, so we put him through the process of gerus al das bezdin, even if it's only al das bezdin. So take a look at Rashi, the first Rashi on the Gemara. Rashi says im ein lo av ve'imo heviyaso lehiskayer. The father's not around. The mother brings the child to bezdin. So really, it's not the mother's choice, but bezdin can decide to be megayer the child. So says the Gemara, my kamash malan, what exactly are you trying to teach me? What are the mechanics over here that allow for bezdin to be matbil the katan? Says the Gemara, because we have a principle, tizchus hulo, because it's to the benefit of the child to finish the gerus process. V'zachin adam shelo b'fanav. Says the Gemara, that's not, we've already learned that principle. We learned it in this Masechta already, and it's also found throughout Shas and other places. But says the Gemara, if the reason why Rav Huna is trying to teach me the case of ger katan matbilan also is because of zachin adam shelo b'fanav tanina, we've already learned that in a brisa. Zachin adam shelo b'fanav ve'ein chaven adam ela b'fanav ve'ein chaven adam shelo b'fanav. That when we're doing a zchus for someone, we don't need them to be present. But when we're doing something detrimental to someone, then of course they need to be present. So therefore, it can't be that Rav Huna was trying to teach us zachin adam shelo b'fanav because he's late to the party. He's an amora. We already knew that from the Tanoim. So therefore, says the Gemara, not correct. Really, Rav Huna was not late to the party, and he did have what to add. Mahu detema oved kochavim behefkera nichale dehakaimalon de'eved va'adai behefkera nichale. Maybe we should assume that a goy would prefer the life of hefkerus. Why would we assume that? Because we know that we hold that by an eved, he certainly prefers the life of hefkerus. Says the Gemara, kamash malon dehani mili gadol de ta'am de isura. The only reason we would ever assume that someone would prefer a life of hefkerus is if that person has already tasted that life of hefkerus. However, aval katan zchus hulo. This is a massive yesod in chinuch that we just learned about. The child has never been exposed to a world of hefker. He would never want the world of hefker. He would rather be a fruma yid, and he would rather not be a part of a world that's hefker. When we put meaning into Yiddishkeit, when we give a lot of meaning, it's more of an anchor, it's more of a plant for children to stay put. And the Gemara says, Lema misayele, maybe this idea that Rav Huna is postulating can be reflected in our very own Mishnah. The Gemara says about a third of the way down in Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Hagioris v'hashvuya v'hashivcha, the 3 women in our case where we assume that there was tashma shamita, sheniftu v'shenizgairu v'shenishtacharu, who then became freed. But if they were pchusos mibenos shalosh shana v'yom echad, but if they were less than 3 years old, then we assume that they get a ksuba of masayim and that they are shaykh to the claim of tainas basulim. Says the Gemara in analyzing this Marimakom, my lab, De'at belinhu al das bezdin, doesn't it seem to be that when it speaks about a case of a giores, that she was converted by bezdin, says the Gemara, lo, that's not at all correct. We're talking about a regular case of gerus in our Mishnah. Who says it's talking about this strange case? It's not. It could be talking about a regular case of gerus. And they just want to do what their father's doing. Lav dafka the way that Rashi understood our Mishnah, lav dafka the way that we initially understood our Mishnah at all. And therefore, you cannot bring a raya from our Mishnah. Nevertheless, the Gemara does conclude that when it comes to a ger katan matbilin oso al das bezdin, that if the father is not around and the mother wants to convert the child, so then we don't need the father to be involved. We can have the bezdin do it on their own. Amar Rav Yosef, while we're talking about the world of gerus, Rav Yosef adds a very important halacha. This is halacha l'maisa and somewhat complicated, not intellectually complicated, but it's halachically has in the continuum of time, as we'll see soon, it's not so simple to execute. Amar Rav Yosef, halfway down Yud Aleph Amar Aleph, higdilu yichol limchos. If a katan goes through gerus, then when he becomes a gadol, he's allowed to be moche. He's allowed to undo by protesting his conversion. So let's say that he becomes 13 in one day and he says, thank you, but no thank you. Then the halacha is that retroactively, he's a goy d'oraisa. You have to be a yid, and in order to be a yid, you have to stay a yid. But because on day one, you decided to not be a yid, so that doesn't work. So then the Gemara says, well, if higdilu is yichol and limchos, then we don't understand our Mishnah. Why? Because what does our Mishnah say? Eisve Abaye. Abaye says, Hagiores ve'ashvuya ve'ashevcha sheniftu v'sheniskayru v'shenishtacharu b'chusos mibnos shaloshanu v'yomechar ksuvas u'masayim. He asks a question on Rav Yosef from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that these three women who are assumed to have had tashmish amita, who became freed, if they're under 3 years old, we assume their basulim will grow back. It says the Gemara, if in fact it's true that if a girl was under 3 when she was violated, that her basulim will grow back. If we also assume that when she becomes 12 and one day she can reject the religion, so then she's going to get a ksuba at the age of 4 or 3. Really? How is that true? We're going to give her a ksuba, and then at 12 she'll become a goya, and she'll leave Yiddishkeit. Just take the money and run. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because we're not even sure she's Jewish in the first place, because once she's being moche, so then it doesn't work. So it says the Gemara, it's a great point, and the answer is l'chiv gadla. The only time she can get her ksuba is when she becomes 12 years in one day, when we verify that she's taka Jewish. So once we verify that she's actually Jewish, so then we're willing to give her ksuba. Says the Gemara, l'chiv gadla nami memachyo benafka. Okay, when she becomes 12 years in one day, it's not in the very second that she converts. Maybe, says the Gemara, maybe it's the case that she'll be mochev and afka, that she'll reject Judaism on the second day when she's 12 years and 2 days old. Who says that this is such an immediate process? Says the Gemara, kevan sheigdila sha'achas v'lo michta shuv eni yechola limchos. If there is a ger katan, then once they become 12 years old and they are not moche, and they're just silent, they don't change their behavior, they're frum. They daven shachris when they were 11 years and X number of hundreds of days old, and they daven shachris when they're 12 years and 1 day old. So halacha l'maisa, they're a yid, and they cannot go back at that point. So the Balei Tosfos are very bothered by this. How is it possible you become 12 years in 1 day instantaneously? Where's the window of time for a person to rebel? So Tosfos at the bottom of the page deals with this. And it's the second to last Tosfos. Tomar v'halok var gadlahi. She's already going to be an adult. So once she becomes that age, it's a problem. And skip to the answer. Rashi said, Tosfos says, if when a girl becomes a woman, she was a ger katan, let's say her parents converted her, or Bezin converted her when she was 5 years old. And then when she was 12 years in one day, she was behaving like a bastor. She dressed the part, she looked the part, she was davening, she made brachos, then she's Jewish. However, if when a woman turns 12 years in one day, she's not behaving like a frum girl, so then that may very well undo her entire Jewish status, and it may make her into a goy. So that was Abaye's take on things. Masiv Rava. Rava asks 2/3 of the way down. He brings a question. Elu na'aros sheyesh lahem knas. Here are the young people who will get a knas for tashma shamita, and they're only in a status of their rabbanon. They're katanim. They're not gedolim. So the tashma shamita that they have is as a katan, and we learned in Maseches Yevamos that the tashma shamita of a katan is really not necessarily that meaningful. So says the Gemara as follows. Who are the children who get a knas? If there's a boy, a katan, who has tashma shemitah with a mamzeres or a nesina, a group of people, kusis is a suffix of what kind of person this is, a woman who's a giores, or on a shivuya, a woman who is held captive, or a woman who's a maidservant. And then in any of these cases, if in fact the tashma shemitah, when the woman that they were with, the girl that they were with, was under 3, the halacha is that they get a knas. It says the Gemara, this is Rava asking, if what could happen is that this girl will turn 12 years old and she could be moche, and she could undo her kerus, so then yahavina lo knas to azlav achla b'giyusa. Does it make sense that we're going to give her a knas? It doesn't make any sense at all, because then she's going to take the money and she's going to spend it on goyish stuff. She's going to go buy tarfus with the money. Why are we giving her anything? She's a goy. Says the Gemara, you're right, l'chikada. We're only talking about giving her money once she becomes a gedola. Says the Gemara, l'chikada nami memachya v'nafka. So when she becomes 12 years in one day, just like we asked for Abaye, we're going to ask against Rabba as well. The same exact idea, that she can maybe reject it once she's already from. So says the Gemara, not true. That once a girl who is a ger katan, and she becomes a gedola, and she behaves like a Jew just for that one day, now she is irreversibly Jewish. It can never go back. This, anyways, is a very rare idea that we would ever have any flexibility to allow Chazara to be Choser and say that really she's not Jewish, but it only applies in this one moment in time. That if when a girl becomes a woman, she turns 12 years in one day, she's still behaving like a Jew, she's a Yid forever and ever, and she can never undo it. She would have to be rebelling from just before 12 years in one day and not behave from on that first day. At least that's how Tosfos understands. So then that would then explain why she could become a goy. And the Gemara just says, Abaye lo amar ke Rava. Why is it that Abaye doesn't entertain the case that Rava entertains? Abaye, who was found, a little bit more, almost halfway down, Rashi, the Abaye there says that we were talking about this case where she gets a ksuba. So, and Rava was dealing with a case about the knas. So the Gemara says Abaye lo amar ke Rava, because hasam knasa hainu taima shlo yechote niskar. You're concerned about giving the knas to the girl. That was Rava's case, and you said, oh, maybe she'll become a goya, she'll be mocha, and she'll take the money and run. That the money wasn't for her. The money was a knas on the child, on the boy, for sleeping with her. It was said that there wouldn't be a chote niskar, that he was able to do an aveira and get off scot-free. And Rava lo amar ke Abaye, Rava doesn't agree to Abaye's svara, because ksuba hainu taima shlo tekal beinav lahotzia. The ksuba, Abaye was concerned, how could you give her a ksuba? Maybe she'll be mocha and become a goy. So says the Gemara, says Rava, that's not what you're concerned, that she's going to take the money and spend it. We don't care how she spends the money. Our concern, says Rava, our concern is that the ksuba is meant to minimize the ease with which a husband can divorce his wife. So therefore, even if she's going to take the money and run, but the husband has to put out the money in order to make sure that it's not simple for him to divorce his wife. That brings us to a new Mishnah. It's really continuing on the same thing about the quality of tashma shamita of a katan. And says the Gemara as follows, the Mishnah, 5 lines from the bottom, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Hagadol sheba'al aktana. If you have an older, a bar mitzvah aged boy who's with a katana, and v'katan sheba'al agdola, or if you have a young boy who's with a bas mitzvah aged girl, umukas eitz, or a woman who was injured by something. She didn't have tashma shemitah, she was injured. So that means a mukas eitz is someone who got a makkah from wood. So something was nichnas ba'osam makom and damaged her. So under those circumstances, so then our Mishnah has to paskin for us to tell us what's going on. And how does our Mishnah paskin? So the Mishnah says that in all of these cases, ksubas and masayim. So that's 3 cases. A bar mitzvah aged boy with an under bas mitzvah aged girl, a young boy who's with a bas mitzvah aged girl, and a mukas eitz, all of them have a regular ksuba. In other words, the tashma shemitah was a 0. That's why the ksuba can still be 200. However, that's only Reb Meir. Chachamim omrim mukas eitz ksubas samana. When it comes to a mukas eitz, the halacha is that the ksub is only 100. The next part of the Mishnah reads as follows: a unique case. Besula, who is an almana grusha v'chalutza min hanisuin. So there's a woman who's a virgin, even though her husband died, or she was divorced, or she got chalitza, min hanisuin. So she was fully married but never had tashma shamita. Okay, so let's just be clear: she's an almana, or she's a grusha, or she's a chalutza, and they got married. So they did kedushin, harad, mikudesh, they did the chuppah, whatever, but they never had tashma shamita. So therefore, she's a basula. But in this later phase of marriage, she's already fully married. What's the din? Last two words on the page: ksubasan mana. Halacha is that her ksuba is only 100 mana. And as well, turning to the top of Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis ve'ein lohen tainas besulim. She also doesn't have a tainas besulim. Maybe there really was tashma shamita. Maybe the Eidim couldn't watch every moment. Fine. And this Mishnah, the last part of this Mishnah is actually offsetting something that we learned in the first Mishnah of the night. So on the second line, on the top line of this page, the Gemara says, "Hagioris v'hashvuya v'hashivcha." If you have a convert or a woman who was held captive or a maidservant, where we assume that tashma shamita was had, sheniftu sheniskairu shenishtachru, and they were freed. And then the Mishnah adds, Yeseros al benos shalosh shanu yom echad, but they're 3 years and 1 day or older. So then ksubasan mana, then their ksuba is going to be 100 ve'einlen tainas besulim, because they were older than 3 years and a day, or I should say, because they were 3 years and 1 day or older. So therefore, we assume their besulim will not grow back. Therefore, they only have a ksuba of 100. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rab. Let's follow the people's names here because it reminds us of something that took place uniquely in the early times of the Amoraim. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rab. So Rabbi Yehuda was one of the few Amoraim, one of the only ones I believe that we know, maybe there was one other one, who learned both under Rav and Shmuel. So just a couple of days ago, we saw the shita of Rab, that Rab was a slightly earlier Amora, and Shmuel was slightly later, but they overlapped. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda was in the base medrash with Rab. What did he learn? Katan ha'bal agdola asam mukas eitz. Our Mishnah treated the case of Katan al-Ba Gdola and Mukas Eitz as different cases. Here, Rav says that if a Katan is intimate with a Gdola, she then becomes a Mukas Eitz. Says the Gemara that Rabbi Yehuda then adds, Ki Amrisa Kame de Shmuel, when Rabbi Yehuda left Rav's base medrash and he flipped over and started learning with Shmuel. Shmuel said, Ein mukas eitz babasar. A woman cannot become a mukas eitz by basar, by a human being. A mukas eitz is an injury. It's not generated by tashma shamita, even from a katan. In other words, tashma shamita is tashma shamita, and mukas eitz is mukas eitz. And Rashi actually says this language. Rashi is 6-7 lines down. Dibur hamaschel ein mukas eitz bebasar adam. Says the Gemara be'ibeula lo havia mukas eitz nami leisa. If the tashma shamita of the katan to the gdola is not enough to sever the besulim, so then they're also not a mukas eitz. It's either a tashmish or it's not a tashmish, but it's certainly not a mukas eitz. And the Gemara says that there's actually another way that this idea was framed out in the Amoraim. Says the Gemara 8 lines down, some say that this discussion about a katan and a gedola as to whether or not there's mukas eitz, this case was explicitly negotiated between Rav and Shmuel. Katan abala gedola, if you have a young child who has tashma shamita with a woman who's a gedola, Rav amar asa mukas eitz, Shmuel amar ein mukas eitz babasar. Here we see this machlokas that Rav says that the mukas eitz would be the result if the katan was with a gedola. Shmuel says no dice, doesn't work that way. If a katan is going to have tashma shamita with a gedola, either it's bia or it's not. And if it's not, then she doesn't become a mukas eitz. That's a different halachic category. Says the Gemara, Masi Rav Oshaya. We have a question on this. Gadol sheba al haktana. If you have a bar mitzvah aged boy and a non-bar mitzvah aged girl, v'katan habal agdola, the reverse, umukas eitz. This is our Mishnah that he's quoting. We said ksubasan masayim divrei Rav Meir. Rav Meir was of the opinion that the ksuba was 200. V'chachamim omrim mukas eitz ksuba samana. The chachamim say that a ksuba is 100. So that pushes up against the sheet of Shmuel, because Shmuel says that a mukas eitz is a 0. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabba Hachi Kamar. Here's the right pshat. Gadol haba al aktana v'lo klum. If a gadol is with a ktana, so then v'lo klum, it's a zero, because since she's under 3 years old, the pachos mikan, under the age of 3, can nosein etzba be'ayin dami. The Gemara gives a very simplistic mashal, that it's as if a person has taken their finger and they place it into their eye. Yes, it's true that if a person rubs their eye with their finger, they touch their eye, there may be a transference onto their finger of a little bit of liquid from the eye. That's possible. But the eye will replenish whatever liquids are there. And the same is true here as well, that if a gadol is with a katana, that if someone who is older is with a katana who's less than 3, so the halacha is that it's true that the basulim will break. However, it will also replenish. So the Gemara says, continuing to answer this, and this is the first sheet over here, that if a katan is with a gedola, then she's treated as a mukas eitz. But a mukas eitz kufa is plukta de Rav Meir v'Rabbanan. That's really where the machlokas of Rav Meir and the Rabbanan is. How so? Amar Rami Bar Chama, what is the machlokas between Rav Meir and the Chachamim about mukas eitz? Says the Gemara, machlokas kishehikirba. The machlokas between the two of them is when the husband knew that something had happened. Take a look at Rashi. This is Rashi Dibur Hamaschal kishehikirba, halfway down. Kishehikirba, kishenichnasa, kishekansa, when they got married, v'kasav la ksuba, and he still wrote the ksuba, haya yodea she mukas eitz. So let's say that a man is marrying a woman and he knows that she's a mukas eitz. She was injured by something. So it says the Gemara, when the husband knows what's going on, he knows about this before he gets married. She divulges that I just want to let you know that I was injured and I don't have a basulim, but I've never slept with anyone. It says the Gemara, what's the machlokas there? 4 lines before the wide lines on Yud Aleph of the base. The Rav Meir medami la bogeres. Rav Meir compares this woman who's a mukas eitz to a bogeres, to an older woman. We know this now for sure, that our marriage age in our community, let's say the earliest is 18, 19, 20, whatever it is. It's pretty young, but it's still not like it was back in the day. By that time, many women, their basulim has disintegrated already, and there's nothing that's going to be stopping the tashmish amita. So where there's a bogeres, then there's also no tainas basulim. So says the Gemara that Rav Meir says that when a woman as a mukas eitz, we treat her like a bogeres, like a woman whose basulim has disintegrated. We treat her like she's had tashmish amita. But what if the husband did not know that there was an injury to his wife? So then, divrei hakol v'lo klum. Then that marriage is a sham. It's a mekach tos. The marriage is a 0 because he married someone under an assumption that she was a basula, and it turned out that she was a beula. The Rav Meir, let's analyze these shittas. Rav Meir, amay medami la lebogeres, nidmi la beula. Why is it that Rav Meir opted to compare a woman who's a mukas eitz to being a bogeres, to compare this mukas eitz to a woman whose basulim has disintegrated? Maybe he should have compared her to a beula like the Chachamim did. So it says the Gemara, last short line, beula, when it comes to a woman who we treat like a beula, someone who no longer has maintained their virginity, that's isabi b'maisa b'dei adam, because someone slept with her. And that's how you become a beula. So Rav Meir wasn't ready to say that a woman who's a mukas eitz is treated like a beula, because that's not what happened. She didn't sleep with anyone. So therefore, what are we left with? She has to be treated like a bogeres, like a woman who lost her basulim, who didn't sleep with someone. However, but this woman who was a mukas eitz, nobody had tashmish amita with her. And now let's ask the question in the converse way against the Rabbanan. Why is it that the rabbis decided to treat her like a beula? According to the argument that we just saw, no one slept with her. Why would you call her a beula? Then nidmi ala bogeres. Maybe you should take the party line of Rav Meir and say that she's a bogeres. This says the Gemara. We cannot say that according to the Chacham. Bogeres lo isabi b'maisa klal. When a woman is a bogeres, nothing has happened to her. Not a mukas eitz, nothing, and no tashmish amita for sure. So let's say that a woman never had a mukas eitz, she was never injured, and she never slept with someone, but she's 35 years old. So she probably doesn't have a basulim anymore. I don't know what the age is where a basulim disintegrates, but it's by then it's probably gone. So the chachamim were bothered. Something happened to this woman. She's a mukas eitz. Something happened. It wasn't tashmish amita, but something severed within her body, something severed the basulim. So bogeres lo isabit b'maisa klal, we're on the second wide line, and isabit b'maisa, this woman did have something happen to her. She was injured. Everyone agrees that if the husband did not know about it, that it's a zero. So on this line, the Gemara now has a question. The Gemara had said that if the husband didn't know that it's going to be below klum, that the relationship is over because it's a mekach tos. So the Gemara says as follows. Sorry. So the Gemara, in trying to answer and trying to explain for the Shitas of Rav Meir and the Chachamim and understanding Shmuel, the Gemara had said that if lo hikirba, that if the husband didn't know that his wife was a mukas eight, so then the relationship is over because of mekach tos. But says the Gemara, that's not so simple. Masiv Rav Nachman, he omeres mukas eight sani. Let's say that a woman is brought to Beis Din the day after they get married, and the husband has a tainus besulim, and she says, I was a mukas eitz. I never slept with anyone. She says I was injured. Who omer loki? That's not correct. Ela drusas ishat. You have been literally trampled by a man. It means that you've been violated by a man. So Rabban Gamaliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omrim, Ne'emenes, that she's believed. We see that she's believed. So therefore, says the Gemara, how can you say that lo hikirba, that if he didn't know that she was a mukas eitz, that the relationship is over? We see in this case that they believed her, which means that it's not so simple that lo hikirba, that the relationship is over and it's a mekach tos. Ella, therefore Rava has to pivot and re-understand his own shita. Ella amar Rava, well, really he's presenting now for the first time. He's going to question his shita shortly. The Gemara says 6 lines into the wide lines, Ella amar Rava, bein hikirba, bein lo hikirba, whether or not the husband knew that his wife was a mukas eitz, the Rav Meir Masayim, the Rabbanon, then according to the Rav Meir Masayim, according to Rav Meir it would be 200 zuz. The Rabbanon, and according to the sheet of the Rabbanon, hikirba mana lo hikirba v'lo klum. That if he knew about it, but again, this is all within the camp of the Rabbanon, that if he knew that she was a mukas eitz, her ksuba would be 100, and lo hikirba v'lo klum. And if he didn't know about it, then the relationship is over. It's a mekach tos. But Rava did not really accept this answer. And the Gemara is going to give a multi-step proof as to how we know that Rava backtracked from his approach here. The Hadar Bey Rava. How do we know? The Tanya, the Brisa writes, Ketzad Hotzas Shemra. What is Hotzas Shemra? We know, of course, that Motzi Shemra is when a person says something that's not true about someone else. Lashon Hara is when someone says something that's true about someone else, but it's just not nice. It's accurate, but it's not nice, and we shouldn't be talking like that. It's Nisr Doraisa many times over. But Motzi Shemra is when you're totally lying. So says the Gemara, Ketzad Hotzas Shemra, 2/3 of the way down. Bala Bezdin v'amar. A man comes to Bezdin and says, Ploni, he says to a certain man, Lo matzasi levitcha basulim. I married your daughter, you're my father-in-law, and I just got married, and your daughter doesn't have a basulim. So says the Gemara, Im yesh edim shezin satachtav. If there are witnesses that say that she was mizana under him, then yesh lak subas mana. Then she gets 100 zuz. The Gemara says, you get 100 zuz for cheating on your husband? That can't be. That's not a time to give someone a ksubas mana. So that can't be what's going on. The Gemara says it must not be what you meant. You're right, says the Gemara. Hachi kamar. The Gemara says, if when this guy comes to Beis Din and he says to Ploni that your daughter doesn't have a basulam, so then if in fact there are edim that she was zinsa tachtav, then it's beskila. Zinsa meikara yesh lak subamana. And if in fact she had znus before they got married, then the halacha is that it's ksubas mana. And continuing with the many levels of this raya to show that Rava changed his mind. This is obviously inferred from what we just learned, that if a man married a woman under the assumption she was a basula, and then it turns out that she's actually a beula, we don't assume that it's going to be a mekach tos, but rather it's ksubas mana. Umasiv Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman asks on this, that if a man marries a woman and doesn't find her basulim, he omeres mishe'erastani ne'enasti v'nistachva sadehu. She says, once we were halachically engaged, she says that she was violated. And when she was violated, she lost her basulim, and v'nistachva sadehu, which literally means that your field is flooded. And this is, as we saw a couple of blot ago, nistachva sadehu is a catchphrase that indicates It indicates it's basically your tough luck. You purchased a field and it got flooded. You and I got engaged, and then she said that she was violated. V'hu omer, no, Loki, you were not violated. Ella ad shelo erastich v'haya mekchi mekach tos. You were engaged and you had tashma shamita with someone. It should be a mekach tos. So says the Gemara, does that imply v'les laklal? And if that's true, the Gemara says that can't be, that she gets nothing at all, because Amar Luhu Reb Chia bar Avin, Efshar Rav Amram Mechol Gdolei Ador Yasvei Kiyamar Rav Sheishas Al Shmais V'Kasha Luhu. This is not something that any of the other Gedolim were talking about. This can't be what the Shaila was. V'Shani, and he responds, My Mekach Tos Nami Mimosayim. Yes, there might have been a Mekach Tos, but it wasn't from 200 to 0 and the marriage is over, but it just lowers the amount from 200 to 100. Aval Mana, Isla, she does get 100. Says the Gemara, how can Rav Nachman say that there was no ksuba at all? V'amar Rava, man de kamosiv shapir kamosiv. I disagree with your approach. Really, Rav Nachman's question is an excellent question. It does imply mekach tos legamre mashma. When you hear mekach tos, you don't assume I got married under the assumption she was a basula, which is 200, and now she's a basula, so I'm lowering my contract to 100. We typically do assume that when there's a mekach tos, that the whole contract is off. So therefore, he has a reasonable question. So says the Gemara, 6 lines from the bottom. It's a good question, and here's how we'd answer it. If there are witnesses that this woman, she cheated, so then she gets killed. She gets skila. And if she was mizaneh, then velo klum, it's a mekach tos. And if this is where we're going to start to see Rava again, that if we have a woman who's a mukas eight, she gets ksubas mana. Oh, how can you say ksubas mana? Rava hu da'amar l'rabbanan lo hikir bavelo klum. Here at the bottom of the page, Rava understood this multi-stepped approach to be that when it comes to mukas eight, that there is a ksubas mana. But earlier in his explanation of Rav Meir and the Chachamim, he said velo klum. He said that there was nothing at all that should count, and it should be a mekach tos. So this is a very lengthy proof. I know it's a little complicated, but it's a very lengthy proof to show us that Rava changed his mind about how he understood Rav Meir and the Chacham. The Gemara now presents a connected case, 3 lines from the bottom on Yud Aleph Amud Beis. Tanu Rabbanan, Kansa Rishon L'Shum Nesuin. Let's say that a woman got married initially to a man for the sake of marriage. It doesn't mean for the sake of marriage. It means that they were married. V'yeshla edim shelo nistera, and there were witnesses that testified that she was never alone with someone. Inami nistera v'lo shasa ktevia, or they were alone, but she didn't have enough time to have bia when they were alone. They were only alone for 2 minutes, and the shiur for Tash B'Shamita is 9-10 minutes, whatever it is. Ein hasheni yachol liton tainas besulim shehare konserishon, because she was initially married to someone. Even though it does say that there was lo nistera, it's not necessarily true. It doesn't take that long for a couple to have Tash B'Shamita. Let's assume 9-10 minutes, like some of the poskim do. So therefore, the halacha is ein hasheni yachol liton tainas besulim. Then the second husband cannot have any concerns about besulim because she really was married. Says the Gemara on the top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Amar Rabba, Zosameres, this implies as follows. That if a woman was married as the assumption of being a basula, and it turned out that she was a beula, so the halacha is that she gets a mana. Ravashi argues, no, be'alma la'olam eimalach les laklal. Really, she gets nothing. The shiny hacha, this case is different, shari kansarisha, because she had already been married. Asks the Gemara of Anechu Shema Tachto Zinsa. Maybe we should be concerned that she was not appropriate. She slept with someone that she shouldn't have. We're not concerned about that because the way the wedding went is that she married her husband and they were intimate right away, and therefore there's no chance that she cheated. Amar of Shravia, some say that this Gemara at the top of this page, the discussion between Rabba and Ravashi took place in regards to a brisa. And what does that mean? So let's read. Vika de masni la masnisin. What's the brisa? The Mishnah, excuse me. The Sula almana grusha chalutza minan isu. And this is the Mishnah that we saw on the very bottom of Daf Yud Aleph base from the Mishnah there. We had said that if there's a woman who's a basula, who actually got married but never had tashma shamita. So says the Gemara that if she's a pesula almona grusha chalitz min anisun, then ksubas almona ve'inlan tainas pesulin, then her ksuba is treated as 100. However, I should not say however, and there's no tainas pesulin. Says the Gemara, besulim and anisun heichim ishkachasla. How do we have a case where a woman is a besula but married? That's a strange reality. We typically assume that the couple was intimate. So it says the Gemara, we're under an assumption that they did taka get married, but there was no time for them to have tashma shamita. And there on that, Rabbah says, that had it been that she married under the assumption that she was a basula, and it turned out she was a beula, then she gets 100. And then on that, Rav Ashi says as follows: Rav Ashi Amar le'olam eimalach be'alma les laklal. Really, that's not true. Really, it should be considered a mekach tos. This is different. She was halachically married, so we have to make some kind of assumption that they might have had tashma shamita. Maybe she cheated. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Shrabi, like the answer we saw before, that that was a case we knew she didn't cheat because she got married right away, and then Adim, and then we know that she went to go have tashma shamita right away with her husband. Now, we just saw two versions of Rabbah and Rav Ashi, one based on a brisa and one based on a Mishnah. The brisa was discussing a case where there was Adim, and the Mishnah was not. And because of that distinction, the Gemara says as follows: according to the first version of the Gemara, which is based on the brisa that's found at the Tanu Rabbanan 3 lines from the bottom of the page, that brisa was talking about Edim, and there we said that there's that we don't trust him, that there's no tainas besulim. Then kol sheken amasnisin, all the more so in our Mishnah where there aren't Edim, of course he's not going to have a tainas besulim. But the reverse is not true. Those who learned that Rabbah and Rav Ashi were really based off of our Mishnah from the bottom of Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, then there that would be true, but that we don't trust him to say tainas besulim. But when it comes to the brisa, he'll say that no, maybe we do listen to the edim, and therefore there is the possibility of a tainas besulim. That brings us to yet a new Mishnah, halfway down Yud Beis Amud Aleph. We're going to learn until the next Mishnah, and then we're going to stop. The new Mishnah reads, that if a man is going to eat a meal in his father-in-law's house in Yehuda, shelo be'edim, he's going to eat with his kala alone, then he can no longer make a tainas besulim, because there was customary that after halachic engagement, they would be able to be alone together. And it was prior to the actual chuppah, and we're going to discuss this in the Gemara. The Gemara says, because it says that for one who happened to have been eating by his father-in-law, that not everybody had this custom in Yehuda, in this location where everybody would eat with their kala b'yichud. Says the Gemara, you're right. You're right. There's different customs throughout Yehuda, some of whom would eat alone with their kala, some would not. Kidatanya, here's what the brisa writes, and the brisa says a lot of details here. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, in the place of Rishona, in the place of Yehuda, they would put the chassan and kala alone together just before the chuppah. They'd make sure they were fully halachically married, but they put them alone a little bit in order to make sure that they're libo gaspa, that they're excited about being with one another. In other parts of Eretz Yisrael, they didn't do this. We learned about this earlier in the Masechta. This is actually the brisa. This is the Tosefta that quotes the idea. There were 2 shoshvinin, one from each side, and they'd make sure that if there were basically that their tashma shamita was done in a way, they're not in the room, of course, but they would verify that there was no tricks happening and that the sheets that they had tashma shamita on, they knew what it was, so that in case a shaila had to be asked, that no one could make a claim against her, no one could make a claim against him. They didn't do that. The men would sleep in the house with the chassan, and the women would sleep in the house with the bride. They didn't do that. And then a cryptic line. We're going to analyze this line, and then we'll stop at the next Mishnah. What is the cryptic line? Anyone who doesn't do this minhag, so then they can't make any tainas. What does that mean? Kol shelo nag kiminag zeh. We don't know what it's talking about. The Mishnah quoted many different customs. So it says the Gemara, Ahaya, on what are we saying the line, V'chol shelo nohag kiminag hazeh, that if you didn't do this, then you cannot say Tainus B'sul. Milema Resha. If you want to say it's on the Resha, where they were being alone with one another. And then it says, if you aren't alone, then Einu Yachol Liton, it should be called Shinag Mi Baile. It said anyone who does that is not allowed to be able to say, is not allowed to claim Tainus Besula. Ella, maybe it's a Seifa talking about the case of Shoshvinin and Kol Shalom Moshmash Mi Baile. And it means that if there isn't someone who is watching over you, some type of shushvin, some type of guard, that's what it should have said. So Amar Abaye, good question. And Abaye responds, La'olam Resha. Really, we're talking about the Resha. We're talking about the case in Yehuda where a man was alone with his wife prior to the chuppah. Vitani, Kol Shenohag. And really, the language shouldn't be Kol Shelo Nohag in our Mishnah, but rather Kol Shenohag. Amar Le Rava, take a look at the Mishnah. It doesn't say what you're saying. V'ha, Kol Shelo Nohag Tani. The version that Rava had also said Shelo. It also said Shelo Nohag. So therefore, we can't understand that it's the Resha. Elama Rava Hachikama. Kol Shelo Nohag Minhag Galil Begalil, Elaminag Yehuda Begalil. Anyone who doesn't keep the minhag of Galil and Galil, but they kept the minhag of Yehuda and Galil, namely that in Galil, even though this wasn't normal, but if they were not knowing like Galil and Galil, and instead what they did is they were alone beforehand, Enu Yachaliton Tainas Basula. Rav Ashi Amar, Lo Olam HaSeifa, really, we are talking about the Seifa, the case of the Shushvanin. We're talking about the case of the guards who want to protect the Chassan from a Taina, want to protect the Kala from a Taina. Seifa Vitani, Kol Shalom Mushmash. We, in fact, do change the text of the Brisa. Here we don't see a pushback on that. It seems to be a little bit of a safer bet. We're going to stop right here, 8-9 lines before the bottom of Yud Bey's Amud Aleph. We'll pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow night at 8:40 with this Mishnah. We'll be learning Daf Yud Bey's Amud Aleph and Daf Yud Gimel. And Emir Hashem will be back together in person on Wednesday night. Wishing you all a beautiful night.